Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And this is a first for us. We are actually on live webcast, so I want to also thank everyone that's joining us through that venue. Thank you for coming here to receive the 2013 annual report from the BC Treaty Commission. Before I get started, of course, I want to acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. I'm the Chief Commissioner, Sophie Pierre, and today with me I have my fellow commissioners, Commissioner Jerry Lampard, Commissioner Dan Smith, Commissioner Celeste Haldane, and Commissioner Dave Haggard. Also have with us the directors from our treaty office, and we have the Director for Communications is Brenna Latimer. So if you have any questions in terms of our communications, please speak with Brenna. And we also have the Director of Process, Mark Smith, and the Director of Funding, Dan Gill. So thanks for being with us today. Today, as the Treaty Commission releases our 2013 annual report, Pathways to Change, we emphasize that now is the time for change. At this point, there's great opportunity for the three parties in the BC treaty negotiations process to collectively achieve lasting agreements through fair and effective negotiations. There are a couple of milestones that I want to bring up. There's, of course, this is the 21st year that we're in this process. But also, yesterday was the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, which is really what is the essence of what we're, the foundation of what we're dealing with here, the Royal Proclamation. So over these past few months, we've also seen that there's been change at the leadership level for our principles. We now have Minister Bernard Valcourt for the federal government. We have Minister John Rustad for the provincial government, and we have two new task group members for the First Nations Summit for the task group. We, of course, still have Grand Chief Edward John, but he's joined now by Cheryl Casimir, who's with us today from the task group. Thank you, Cheryl, for being here. And I believe that we also have, is that Howard in the back? We also, yeah, that is Howard in the back. I didn't realize you were here. I thought Ray, I think we also have the co-chair, Ray Harris, from the First Nation Summit, rather. And the other task group member is our former colleague, Robert Phillip. He's was here with us at the Commission and has just recently joined the task group as a task group member. So we've got this change in leadership, and we're looking at the change in leadership as part of us moving forward and using that we can create a new atmosphere. But we also need to bring with us what we've learned from the past. Last year, we talked about the successes that we have had in the process, because last year was our 20th anniversary, and we're looking at, it seemed that there were more and more delays, and it seemed like this process was taking so long, but we really needed to take a look at what had actually been accomplished, and that there were successes, and that we need to look at those and learn from them. And so now we're saying with this new leadership that together we face the challenges and embrace the opportunity for change. This time last year we stressed also that while there was much to learn from those successes, that we also needed to learn from the challenges that still existed. So over this past year, we've continued to see the tables moving forward, and that we've seen some positive change for First Nations communities that have actually started to move forward. I just want to give you a few examples. Two of the Tsimshian First Nations, Kitsilas and Kitsimkalam, have recently ratified their agreement in principle. The Tliamin Nation's final agreement was approved unanimously in the BC legislature during the spring session, and it's expected to proceed for ratification in Parliament in the fall session. Wekano Nation overwhelmingly approved their AIP in July with 94% in favor. And also the Yale First Nation, their final agreement finally reached royal assent on June 19th of this year. And they're now working towards setting an effective date for their implementation of their treaty. For more examples of First Nations who are successfully moving forward, we have those, of course, in the status reports in the 2013 annual report. A lot has happened. A lot has gone on this year, 2013. You know, we started out, there was a lot of dissension starting to build up about this time last year, and then we went through November and December with all of the Idle No More. And then on January 11th, of course, we had the meeting between the Prime Minister and the Assembly of First Nations chiefs, and in particular our National Chief, Sean Atleo. And in that meeting, the leaders, both the Prime Minister and the First Nations leaders, they committed to address a number of significant issues facing Aboriginal peoples in this country. One of these was a comprehensive claims policy. Following this meeting, the BC Treaty Commission sent a letter off to the Prime Minister's office containing recommendations that we assert are essential to achieving progress in the negotiations, and that will lead to finalizing more treaties in British Columbia. So our recommendations included that. We underscored again how important and how necessary it is to have leadership and oversight coming directly from the Prime Minister's office. We keep reminding the federal government that First Nations and BC, or First Nations in particular, are negotiating these treaties not with I still want to call it the Department of Indian Affairs, but the Aboriginal Affairs. They're negotiating these treaties with the Government of Canada. And so that's why this oversight, this needs to come directly from the Prime Minister. It gives the message that the whole government is involved in these negotiations, not just Indian Affairs. And also, Canada must ensure that the Section 35 sections of our Constitution, that they become a policy directive for all government departments, so that Section 35 obligations of Canada are fully realized. And that's a question that we continue as a commission, that we put forward to the various departments that we have to deal with, such as environment, for example. One of the areas is migratory birds. Well, how is environment ensuring that Canada is living up to its Section 35 obligations in terms of migratory birds? That's just an example. So we continue to raise that. We've also made recommendations in terms of this. Canada was going through yet another study, and they're doing results-based analysis, and they're looking at a new approach. And we're suggesting that whatever new approach that they're talking about in terms of the negotiations and which tables are further ahead, etc., that they always include an exit strategy for those First Nations that for whatever reason become disengaged from treaty negotiations, and that the issue of the loans and the debt must be dealt with. It cannot be overlooked. That has to be part of any kind of exit strategy. And if the federal government truly wants to make treaty negotiations more effective, it must address the whole question of mandates. Not just how existing mandates move through the present system, but also there needs to be a willingness to look at changing those mandates, to look at updating those mandates so that we can overcome key challenges. Particular mandate challenges that continue to plague many tables, of course, is fish. I don't need to, we've been saying that every year. We still don't have a mandate on fish. But there are also mandate challenges in terms of fiscal measures. And lastly, we recommend that a technical working group that's been created here in British Columbia called the Recognition and Certainty Technical Working Group, that they be tasked directly with the looking for ways of exploring opportunities to advance interim measures that both support treaty negotiations and provide alternatives to negotiations. So we're saying that there are particular mandate areas also that this working group could be looking for solutions on the mandate areas around fish, around fiscal measures like taxation and like own source revenues. Those are major issues, and we need to have some real focused study on that. We closed our letter offering our assistance to the Prime Minister and his government and reminded him that acceleration of treaties will result in multi-billion-dollar benefits to the Canadian economy. The Prime Minister's response letter stated that he shared our views about, in quotes, the potential economic benefits from concluding modern treaties, both for Aboriginal communities and for the Canadian economy as a whole, and that negotiated agreements help to create jobs and businesses, attract investment, and strengthen Aboriginal communities. So our annual report this year, we also expressed the Commission's concern about the province's apparent movement away from long-term solutions through treaty in favour of short-term economic opportunities, as indicated in the mandate letter from Premier Clark to Minister Rustad. While the Treaty Commission understands the importance of economic development, and we certainly support that First Nations need to be part of any economic resurgence in this province, that it does not believe it should be at the expense of reaching lasting treaties with First Nations. So what we're saying is that it's not an either-or. We have to be at a place where we can do both, that there are certain economic opportunities, and in fact that's what Interim Measures was all about, was saying that First Nations should not have to wait until after a treaty is signed in order for them to benefit from economic opportunities in this province. So the province is moving ahead on that, and that's good. We encourage that. We've always said that. Year after year, we've said that at our annual reports. However, it can't be at the expense of lasting agreements. Also, the challenge of overlapping and shared territory disputes continues to be of concern to the Commission. As we highlight in our report, this is not simply a First Nations concern. It's primarily a First Nations concern, but not just the First Nations. It is a larger issue that impacts reconciliation. The federal and provincial governments have an interest in resolution of these disputes, as both have staked a great deal of their future economic success on resource development. Since becoming Chief Commissioner in 2009, I have observed the principles, particularly the federal government, as I've stated in my letter, go from pillar to post, reviewing, studying, analyzing issues, rather than just getting on with the hard work of negotiations in good faith, leading to completed and implemented treaties. And that is a very important point that we also stress as a Commission, is that we need to be looking at the implementation of the treaties that we have. And we've expressed some concerns in that area, as you will see in our annual report. So, as I stated in our letter this year, in my letter this year, there's no need or time for more studies. We just need to get it done. Thank you very much. We're now open to questions.
Sophie Rousseau with Radio-Canada. How detrimental to the whole treaty process has been this change of approach by the federal government, mainly having these, I guess they have a priority set and they decide to choose which table they go according, is that right, to the resources they need to achieve in certain areas?
Well, they were involved in a study called the results-based analysis, and that seemed to be the intent, although it's never been really very clear just what was expected to come out of this results-based analysis. But I think it's pretty clear that there are some tables that have not moved as fast as others, and there are some First Nation negotiating tables that I think would be prepared to step away from negotiations if there was an exit strategy that would work and that would deal with such things as we've suggested as the debt. So I can't say yes or no that that's what they're in. They actually have a list anywhere. I don't know that, but I think certainly that was the intent of doing the analysis. However, we'll never know or we don't know yet anyway. The results were supposed to come out last spring, and they've now been put aside for yet another study.
Just looking at it from the point of view of a First Nation that was deciding, or trying to look at it from the point of view of a First Nation that was deciding which path to take, if they were just looking at results across the province, wouldn't it be awfully tempting to just go for interim measures? You don't need to sign away everything for all time. The provincial government is open to revenue sharing and resource sharing. You get jobs and an agreement in fairly short order, as opposed to years at the treaty table. You don't end up with a huge debt to Ottawa. You don't have to wait for the feds to come up with a mandate on fish. And you can focus your own limited resources on the one thing, like training your young people to work in a sawmill or starting a winery. I'm just thinking at it from the point of view of many of the medium-sized and smaller First Nations in the province. Isn't the way things that has evolved, interim measures just make a lot more sense for most communities?
Well, I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, this should not be an either-or situation. There's not just one solution. And this is something that I said last Friday when we were in the economic summit looking at the economy of BC. We're saying that with First Nations, for some reason, we all seem to want to find that one solution. There isn't just one solution. There's different ways of doing it. There are some First Nations, yes, that they're not prepared to right now go down looking for the long-term solution. Eventually, though, I would expect that they will be, because when we're talking about the short-term solution, we're talking about looking at kind of one-off economic development projects. That still means that First Nation has accepted that it is under the Indian Act, on an Indian reserve, maybe having some benefits for some things coming forward. But if, as most First Nations are looking towards jurisdiction and they're looking towards exercising their Section 35 rights within their whole traditional territory, the best way of doing that is through a treaty. So there are many solutions. And what we're raising our concern about is that we find that usually it's like there's got to be one solution or another. It's either treaty or it's legislated self-government or it's the Indian Act. Like it's just one thing, but it isn't. There are a number of ways.
Tom Fletcher, Black Press. I just want to follow up on Vaughn's question. The latest thing, we've seen a whole series of forest sharing agreements. The latest thing is mining agreements. I just want to clarify, are you saying that in some way represents a setback from final agreements or treaties in those areas?
No. What I'm saying is that there isn't a question being, or there shouldn't be a question being put to the First Nation that you have an opportunity to enter into a revenue sharing agreement, but it's only that you don't pursue treaty or you don't pursue a legislative self-government. We have situations where we've got First Nations that are very much in treaty negotiations that also have mining agreements or other revenue sharing type of agreements. My own nation is a good example of that. But then you've also got the First Nations that are they have their legislative self-government, and they've got agreements where they're looking at different economic opportunities. Look at West Bank. They're looking at this private health opportunity, and then you have First Nations that just say they're not interested in either treaty or legislative self-government. They're simply going to remain an Indian band under the Indian Act, but they're doing very well. All you have to do is look at Osuyu's Indian band, Chief Clarence Louis. So there's all these different opportunities, and we're not saying that one should stop another. That's really our message here.
Les Lane, Times Colonist. You mentioned the issue of loans and debt has to be addressed. Can you refresh my memory about what the general terms are for the loans out so far and what the total is? And when you say it has to be dealt with, what do you think exactly has to happen? What has to be done?
Okay, the actual numbers, for ease of purpose, they are in our report. Okay, so you can get all those big, and they're big numbers. You can get those there, because I think we're over the $500 million mark. Are we not, Dan? Yeah. 471 million that we've that are out in loans. Now, the way that the funding is set up, 80% comes in the form of loans, and that's shared by the federal and provincial government have parts of that. But 80% that the First Nation takes on is a loan. 20% is contribution. So over the last few years, we've found that we've been in a position where we've been able to just advance the contribution part, not so much the loan, so that we stop building the loan. But of course, it means you don't have enough financial resources really to do all the things that you want to do. So yeah, I mean, we've been pointing that out. It's a growing problem. We need to deal with it. So what we're saying is that if there are First Nations that are going to pull away from the treaty table, pull away from negotiations, that we need to have a clear path on what we're going to do with the loans. And quite frankly, we've said in a lot of these instances, we need to be looking at ways to forgive those loans. Particularly if you've got a First Nation that wants to go ahead, pull away from treaty, and they want to get into these economic development opportunities that are being discussed here. They want to enter into like an equity portion of some mine, but no bank's going to look at them because they're sitting there with this great big loan. So it has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with in a realistic manner.
Would forgiving the loan for a First Nation that wants to pull out of the talks after 10, 15, 20 years, would that be an acknowledged failure of the process in at least that one specific table? That looks like just a giant waste of money.
Well, you really want to look at a giant waste of money, just look at the amounts that get poured into this big black hole with the federal government called Indian Affairs. I mean, my God. With this, you've got situations where you've been in negotiations. First Nations entered into these discussions expecting good faith negotiations. And I think really what it speaks to is the lack of real good faith negotiations that we've had. And this is what we keep bringing up, that we have major concerns in terms of the mandate. How can you go 7 years with no mandate on fish? I mean, for the coastal First Nations, fish is like air, so yeah, I don't know that it says that it's a failure, because clearly we have some successes in this process, but it's not worked as well as it could have for some First Nations. If you guys want to add anything at any point, just let me know. Dan, you wanted to, maybe Dan can also speak to that. Dan?
Even on the fish? Yeah, many of the challenges, one is recognition of our rights and title to the lands and the resources. That has to come forward, and all citizens of Canada and British Columbia have to really understand what that means. It provides certainty for government and the people. It also provides certainty for the First Nations with respect to the negotiations. In regards to fisheries, we had indicated years ago to the two ministers that don't curtail all fisheries as a result of the Fraser River stock going down. Because when you look at the province of British Columbia, it is detriment to the Haida, Tsimshian, Nisga'a, as well as the coastal communities, the Nuhulk, Haisla, and not Haisla, the Hiltsik, and because the Fraser River stock comes down there. And there's been a number of studies, and Chief Commissioner had indicated these studies. We've got to remember Peter Pierce's report in 1982, $50 million spent on that to look at the fisheries and how fisheries can be enhanced, not only for First Nations, but in the commercial area as well. And so these systemic barriers are there, and there's an attitudinal barrier as well with respect to trying to modify Aboriginal rights and title to the land and the resources. So we need to be able to educate MLAs, MPs, citizens, regional districts, municipalities, and really get the message out and say, here's our contribution as First Nations. That's the bell. No. Exactly. Yeah. We need to really enhance the messaging to the general population that negotiations with First Nations. Building capacity is another area. So the education gap continues to widen. And so we need to all support that. And just one last word with respect to the support. The Reconciliation Canada that happened a couple of weeks ago, in the pouring rain, 70,000 people marching down the street, recognizing governments legislation to to have the residential schools, and so the people came out in droves. And I think that's a good indicator that the people support First Nations in recognizing their rights and title and the need for negotiations.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Jerry Lampert?
Yeah. Les, getting back to your question about the debt, there are those First Nations in the process who are committed to the process, and as part of negotiating a final agreement, there'll be an understanding and an agreement that they will receive a capital transfer, and the capital transfer is intended for ongoing expenditures related to becoming a First Nation with a final treaty, but part of it is also a recognition that they have a debt to pay back. The problem now is that this has gone on so long with so many delays that the amount of the capital transfer is being eaten up or potentially eaten up by the necessity to repay the debt. So we've got this ongoing problem both with those committed to the process and those who may want to withdraw from the process. And it's something up to now in Canada that Canada just hasn't been willing to address since they're the principal holder of the debt. So it's something we pursue, as we say in the report, to try to come to some understanding.
I just want to ask you, how are nations that are not sitting on some trove of potential resources like natural gas or oil, how are these nations impacted by the fact that the federal government, especially, and provincial government are pursuing aggressively to reach some conclusion, even in short term, with nations that are located close to these treasures and resources? Is there a conflict? Like some tables are really left behind because actually so much focus is on the ones that have a potential to reach agreement where there are huge resources that are sought after.
Well, I think that's what we've seen just in terms of the direction that was given to Minister Rustad, is to work with those First Nations that are in areas of the province where there's a great deal of economic activity. And so our message is, that's good, but don't forget that you've got the rest of the province. And some of those First Nations are in treaty, and they need to have a process that's going to continue to work for them. And also, there are many First Nations that also are not in the treaty process, and they also need some process that's going to be working for them. We can't. This is where we just come back to our whole message, which is it's not either or. We have to be looking at the whole province. We have to be looking at the whole issue. Jerry, did you want to add something else?
Yeah, if I could just add, if you look in our report at the status report section, you'll see a listing of First Nations in advanced agreement and principle negotiations. Very important from our point of view, a very important group of First Nations because they're almost there. Many of those First Nations are not in areas that you refer to and are very close to agreement in principle. So it's really mixed.
Hi, Dirk Meisner from Canadian Press. You said you received a letter earlier this year from the Prime Minister where he said treaties are important, good for the economy, and we need to settle them. And then I look at your letter, and you're basically accusing Ottawa of ragging the puck and not really wanting to come to the table. So what's going on?
Well, I think we keep our message is that we need to have this oversight, not just one letter coming from the Prime Minister, but actually the oversight. And we've got there's an opportunity maybe that we're hopeful for, the Senior Oversight Committee that's looking at comprehensive claims. So long as that does not set aside or lead us into another long-term study, what we're saying is that if we can get the focus of the federal government to look at their mandates, to look at what's holding up this process, and actually to get the push, the direction from the Prime Minister's office that says, yeah, this is a priority, we need to get it done. Then you have the machinery of government that actually starts to move on that. But if you don't have that, it just spins its wheels like it always does. And I remember my very first press conference with you folks, and I was saying that the concern that I have coming in as Chief Commissioner is that the whole treaty process is dealt with as a program by the federal government in particular, and to some instances by the provincial government. And it's not. We're in negotiations, and we need to get away from that mindset. So if this particular path that we're going on with the Senior Oversight Committee on actually looking at comprehensive claims, if that can get us back on track in terms of real negotiations and looking for solutions in First Nations communities, instead of just this continuing sort of circle that we're in, then that's what we're encouraging that to happen. But you really need that direction to be coming from the Prime Minister's office. He needs to give that indication that this is something that is good for Canada. I mean, we know it's good for Canada. We've been saying that forever, but it's hard to get that message through.
You referred to your first session with us. I've forgotten how many of these I've sat through.
It's 5
in
now.
the 20 years that we've been getting these reports. What would be a useful thing to say to British Columbians about this process and whether or not it's worth saving, given how many years? Like, if you'd said at the beginning when this was started, it's going to 21 years from now, you'll have a handful of agreements and a commissioner standing there telling the governments to get with it. Mm-hmm. Is the process itself worth saving? Is there enough there to be worth saving, and can the public do anything about it?
The short answer is yes. We do have a process, and this is what we said in our report last year, that we do have a process that works. We put into place a Made in BC treaty negotiation process. And we have the successful treaties in Tawasin, in Mulnoth. We now finally have Yale that has gone through, but I mean, they still need to have looking towards their effective date. We've got Sliammon. They're going to be working towards they need to get through the process also in Ottawa, and then they'll be looking towards the effective date. So we have a process that works. It's not great. It's not the best. There are some First Nations that don't want to have anything to do with it. You know, that's fair enough. But in terms of what the First Nation has determined for themselves, they're wanting to see reconciliation by way of a long-term, of a fully negotiated treaty, something that is going to bring all of us together, the nation and the rest of British Columbians, the rest of Canadians, together on the long journey. And that's what they want. There's a process that is in place that can support that. What we find, though, is that there are the stumbling blocks that come up. They just don't seem to be dealt with in a timely manner. This whole business of having a mandate on fish, you know, we're working with DFO. I don't want to be just ragging on them all the time. We are working now with DFO, and we're working with them to have solutions that aren't always like a one-size-fits-all. And the federal government is usually looking at that. They're wanting, you know, the one major solution, and we're saying, well, maybe what we can do is we can have a series of small solutions that address the big picture. So that is the kind of working relationship, and that's the kind of solution that we see going forward with all the various ministries. So, yeah, I think that we do have a process that's worth saving, but it's just it needs to have a focused commitment to get certain things done. And we've made specific recommendations, so if we could follow up on those recommendations, that would be awesome. Celeste, and then Dave also has comments.
I think what Sophie is alluding to there are fixes that need to happen within the process itself. And capacity is one of them. So one of the recommendations going forward to both the federal and provincial government would be to devote the necessary human capacity that is required from both governments to these negotiations. Yes, we recognize that there are significant projects moving forward economically within the province, and we support those. But they can't detract the resources that are necessary to treaty negotiations or from treaty negotiations. That's some of the challenges that we see moving forward, is some of the capacity that both the federal and provincial government have with regards to humans has been moved aside. And that's something that their system needs to look at as well, because we have to dedicate the time and resources to treaty negotiations parallel to the economic negotiations that are happening in other areas of the province. So that would be one of the small fixes as we see, and going from region to region, seeing where increased capacity is required, not so much maybe, but recognizing that two parallel processes are being unfolded. One is economic negotiations, the other is treaty negotiations, and either or, it should never happen. They should be moving along parallel. Some of the other small fixes are the mandates, and we've talked about that quite significantly today, and it's in our report, and it's something that has been raised in the past around both the federal and provincial mandates. So when we look at small fixes, you can look at different regions and different tables, and perhaps there's maybe a flexibility that is required at those tables to address some of the issues. That would be fixing a little bit of the mandate, to provide that flexibility for these treaty negotiations to move forward. So we have to start having creative and innovative thinking coming from both the provincial government, the federal government, and of course we support that, moving forward. So those would be some of the small fixes that we see, and looking at different regional requirements to move treaty negotiations. Thank you.
Celeste. Dave?
Thank you. I think it's an interesting question that you ask, is the process worth saving? And to answer that question, you have to ask yourself what the alternative is. And if you recall, before the process ever started, the negotiation process, First Nations spent all their time in courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, fighting with the federal government and the provincial governments on the right to some type of a fair and just settlement in the province of British Columbia. This is the process. Now, you can toss the process out and go back to court and spend millions of dollars again on whether First Nations have the right, but the Supreme Court has been very clear on their ruling. Go and negotiate treaties in the province of British Columbia. The challenge we have, and Sophie said it several times this morning, is the challenge we have is convincing the federal and provincial governments that negotiations have to be fair and just to First Nations. And that's how the process must change. You say, what can British Columbians do about that? Well, I say you can talk to your MPs, talk to your MLAs, and say, we support First Nations getting a fair and just settlement on the land question in this province, so that they can have a fair economic opportunity in British Columbia, so they can have a better place to live on the land that they've occupied for thousands of years, so they can have economic development in a fair and just settlement, instead of oil and gas companies running around with the spice of the moment as they're trying to hand out millions of dollars in the north. Go through Terrace and Prince Rupert and Smithers and see what the oil companies are doing up there today. Like, it's almost laughable when you see what they're trying to do, the first one through the door so they can buy off another Indian. That's not how it's going to happen with First Nations in that part of the world. They're going to sit down to the table and they're going to have a fair and just set of negotiations for occupying and usage of their land and the resources that are there.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions? That kind of says it all, huh? Well, thank you. No, that's why he spoke last. So thank you again for joining us today. And if you have any questions, we'll be here. And also, communications director is always available to arrange for one of us to speak with you. So, and I know we, as I mentioned, we have people here from the First Nations Summit from the task group. You may want to also speak with them. So thank you very much, everyone.